All right. Good morning, evening, afternoon. I'm Jeff with the
I'm also-
Versus.
I queued in too early because we're in a different area, so my time space is just different. So I'll just skip to the part where I'm telling you my name is Matthew, even though it's Matthias. You should probably just disregard the mess up. But hi, I'm Matthias.
Yes, we're a different location. Things coming up, so we had to adjust as you do.
Yeah,
But we here, we live,
we are in fact live. Welcome to the Versus.
and we would like to talk to you guys about a topic we haven't. We're mentioning a lot, but it's not one that we've kind of honed in on for a little while.
Yeah.
And that is open mic culture.
Yeah, man. Okay, so I don't know how many of you out there raise your hand if you've been to an open mic before. That's something they would do in an open mic, but I can't even see them.
They would do that at an open mic.
I can't even see what they're doing.
Do that.
But yeah, so here, do you want to kind of explain what is an open mic? Because I think there's a lot of different kind of interpretations of what open mics are.
That's true. Yeah, so I would define open mic as a space where there may be a scheduled reader, but the main focus is that you have your own poem that you would like to share with the world. And so you go to this place where there's other people, usually poets, and they call out your name because you can sign up, and you go to the stage and you can read a poem. And then when you finish, people politely clap, and then they call up the next poet.
Or impolitely jeer at you, but typically it's clapping.
Yeah, sometimes there's some heckling involved, depends on the venue.
If I'm there or not.
Pretty much, yeah. Usually, these days I just hang out in the back and judge you.
That's facts.
And yeah, did I miss anything?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I think that, and kind of the formula behind it is different for a lot of spots, because I've been to some open mics where the way that they have to organize the open mic or how people perform is kind of shifted. I've been to some spaces where everybody signs up, that wants to be on the open mic, they'll sign up to be on the open mic, but the people that host the show have kind of a pre-organized, these are the numbers that we're calling, you know what I mean? So let's say you have 30 spots on this piece of paper, but then the open mic, the host, they're like, whoa, we're gonna be calling these, and it's not necessarily the first to going straight down. What it typically is they'll kind of go through and they already have written down the first 10 we're calling is number 2, 6, not, what I'm saying, stuff like that. I feel like that kind of organization behind it it feels a little bit discouraging if you are. I wasn't actually on the open mic that night for that show, but I remember watching it and be like, that feels kind of discouraging. It feels like if you're gonna do any kind of variation of that, you should do it from top to bottom, because in that way you can really reward the people that are signing up first. But I guess with that kind of mentality, a lot of people aren't necessarily signing, even if they came first, they don't necessarily sign their name on the first line. So
that is true, unless you specifically mandate that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
that's a good question. If you arrive first at an open mic, should you expect to be able to go early in the show?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, because I think it's if you arrive first, at the very least you should be guaranteed to go up, I would say.
Should be a chance for you to read.
Yeah. Because, especially if the thing that you're trying to encourage, and this is, again, these are just kind of general, observations and maybe suggestions from personal standpoints. But yeah, I think that if you're trying to encourage people to come to your show at a specific time, and you really want to encourage your audience to start filling things up at a specific time, then you probably want to reward the people that are, there when the show initiates. So, but yeah, so I've been to shows like that. We went to a show, Apples and Snakes. It's a really interesting name. It was a really cool show in London, and with their open mic, this was really cool. So it was kind of the same way. So essentially, everybody that wanted to be on the mic, open mic, they signed their names, and then the people that were working the doors, so to speak, but the doors kind of, it's not necessarily actually the doors. Like there's this table on the other side, but for all intents and purposes, it's like the door kind of, right. They would write your name on this piece of paper, and then everybody's name would go into this bowl, right. And then so essentially there was 2 opportunities for the open mic. So it was an open mic show, but there were like 3 features that all had, I think, like 10 to 15 minute slots. So it was kind of it was kind of I won't say it was a longer show, because it actually, the show didn't seem like it was going too long, but it was a really large show. It was a really large show in London. And so yeah, essentially, but to open up the show, the host would pull 5 names out of the bowl, and when he calls your name, you kind of walk from the general audience and you go over to the side area, like the side bench is like red bench. They made a really big deal out of it, like you get to sit at the red bench, right. And so you sit over at the red bench, and then that's your open mic to start the show. You know what I mean? Like now, the host is like, you're coming up, you're on deck, but the next person is bam, 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 and then they do those 5. They have the feature artists, and then in the second half of the show, and that's where I was actually able to perform. They pull 5 more names, and they do the same exact thing. And I actually thought that was a really cool concept, because, and also is like, because I don't want to say that it couldn't be done here. I think that there is something to people supporting other artists because they just really love the art in their city or the art in their community to flourish. So it's like, to them, it was like, yeah, if I don't get to perform, so what? I really want to be able to see, my fellow poets, my fellow artists perform and support, because I know, I'll get to perform one of these days, and you know what I mean. And it was like, it was so wholesome, because it was just like everybody, no matter who went up, no matter how many and who wasn't called or whatever, it was like they were just still excited to see the show happening, and seeing people perform. So yeah, I thought that was a really cool. Now I think there's a couple elements that you kind of need for something like that. Like you kind of need a really kind of a large show, you know what I mean, in order to do something like that. And you have to have a host that is willing to get out the way. And that's, I don't say that's tough. And maybe it's not even necessarily rare, but when it's not happening. Like, do you kind of know what I mean? Like when like hosts are kind of in the way of the show, you know what I mean?
I think it's a tricky balance, because you want to host that, in a lot of ways, the host is the person that kind of shapes the show and kind of gives direction to how the whole vibe is going to feel.
Yeah.
So you do need a host that has some sort of presence. Because if it's just like the host comes up and just calls out the name and then sits down and then comes up and calls the next name, like that's not.
Yeah, that's the other extreme. Yeah.
However, you also don't want the dominating personality. I think a lot comes to just being able to read your audience and kind of seeing what they're able to pick up from you. If you need to get that, you can.
Okay.
But while that's happening, so other things that kind of happen with open mics too that I think are important to just keep in mind. I think there's certain rules of etiquette that also occur. In terms of if you're not selected to read, how do you handle that? I think sometimes people get upset or frustrated by that. Another thing that happens too is that maybe a poet is selected to read, and there's some expectations that come into play, right? So if I'm chosen to read and I do my poem and I'm towards the beginning of the show, sometimes you see some poets interpret that as permission to leave the show. It's like, hey, I've read my poem. I'm done. You've been graced with my presence. And then you immediately see them walk towards the door. And I've been at some shows where the host, you see someone does that the first time you meet them. There's not a whole lot you can do. But like the second, the third, the fourth time, what I've seen hosts do is that they call that person up later in the show. They might even be called up to be the last person in the show, so you definitely can get kind of a reputation for yourself if you're not being careful. So again, general good etiquette is okay. Like if you're gonna read a poem, like if you've been called up for your open mic, then also have the courtesy to listen to some of those other poets. You don't have to necessarily stay for the whole show, but hey, maybe you can hang around for another 15, 20 minutes. You know, it's just a sign of respect. Other people took the time to listen to you, so then you can also share that same time. Because there's also kind of community building aspect of it. You know, when you're going to an open mic, in general, people are looking for an audience if they're the people reading. And so it's just not very respectful to your audience. And you don't want to have that reputation in the community where you're in. Other things that you see with shows too, Matthias was talking about hosts that kind of overimpose. So it's trying to find that balance too. I think if you have an open mic, like maybe your own open mic, or maybe there's just an open mic that you frequent, like something you might want to ask yourself is what seems to be the goal of the open mic? I mean, yeah, all open mics, speaking specifically for poetry open mics, the emphasis is on trying to give a space for people to share poetry. But every place does that in a specific way. Some open mics, their whole goal is they're catering to a crowd that's maybe doing more slam competition and things like that. So that's kind of something to be cognizant of. But other open mics, the goal is to maybe they're a little bit more welcoming to newcomers to poetry. So just trying to give people that opportunity. I think both of these sorts of spaces exist in Columbus. Some open mics are looking for, they really go a lot more hardcore into like the experimental work. And then some open mics just almost approach it more just from a pure entertainment perspective. I mean, yeah, there's poetry, but I think these are the places where you see the host kind of get a little bit more involved in the show, where it becomes, again, it's our primary focus is, yeah, we're doing poetry, but that's not, hey, if you do a good poem, great, even better. But our main focus is just, we're going to make sure you have a good time before you leave. So I think it's important when you go into open mic, or even more important, if you have your own open mic, is trying to decide what is the goal that you're trying to do with your audience and the posts that you bring up.
Yeah. And
what's that? Got you. Okay.
Sorry for the interruption, everybody. But so one of the things that I was even like, as I hearing you say, like, kind of deciding what the kind of what the direction and what your audience is looking for and kind of what you're providing for your audience. I think one of the things that just when I was talking about when it comes to hosts being in the way, and I'm sure you probably covered a little bit of this ground here as well, but just the thought that I think being on stage and being a host is it's not an easy thing. It's not a natural thing to everybody. I think some of the rhythms of hosting seem like, oh, I could do that. Like that seems like something that I could do fairly easy, but it's really not, because you have to be able to know, okay, is this a time that I'm going to chime in with a joke or something like that to kind of lighten the mood? Or is this a time to be a little maybe somber and kind of, get people from one poem to the next? Or you got to be able to keep time. You got to be able to, kind of test the energy and kind of run things as smoothly as possible, and try to avoid as much as you can kind of like awkward spaces or awkward pauses, because those happen during poetry shows. And you also have to really pay attention to each artist, because you don't want to get up on stage and wanting to crack wise about somebody's poem, or maybe you do. I mean, maybe you're good enough to be able to say, well, maybe I can kind of crack a joke after a really serious poem, something of that nature. So yeah, I mean, the people that I was able to kind of learn from and really benefit from, I think that like there were people that were really, really good at that, and I was able to add my own kind of twist whenever I host things. But yeah, it's more than anything, I think that if you kind of come away, there's some shows that are kind of very wrapped around their host, but it's also because the host is good at what they're doing, which is I want to make sure that the artists are shown kind of the due respect and given this space to really, push themselves and prevail in this space. But also, I really want the audience to be able to have fun and kind of intermixing those two things. So, yeah, making sure that you're a host that, I might be the person that's kind of vacillating the space, maybe, you know what I mean, but I'm not the absolute star of the show. Like, the star of the show realistically is the audience, right? Because the audience is the ones who, hopefully they're getting something from this experience. And I think that if you just are a whole bunch of, and again, poets can be audience members once they're not the performers anymore. So, you're kind of catering to them in a way in both aspects.
Yeah, 100%. I think also part of the host role too is also I mentioned earlier about having kind of a goal in mind with your show, or like knowing what your focus is. And I think the other part of that too is being able to adhere to it too, because I think we've all seen hosts where like they'll set some ground rules in the beginning, and then halfway through the show you got already people breaking your rules. Like if you're like, hey, one poem, and then someone's like, oh, can I read a second poem? And like, okay, you can read your second poem. Or saying, hey, Rome doing poems. It's like, hey, I have this short story. Or
see, and the thing is like with the whole second poem, because that's a very tropey thing in the open mic community. Like people will try it every single time, especially if you have like the rule up already. Because a lot of times when you don't even have the rule and they just see other people doing one poem, they might not want to break those kind of norms. But if you have that rule, and they're like, the thing that they'll try to do is kind of negotiate it. So as opposed to maybe even asking, that you'd be like, I got one poem and then one short one, and then
it's always a short one.
I'm like, yeah, no, it's not a short one. It's not short enough. I promise you.
Yeah, or they'll be like, hey, I'm going to read a bunch of haiku, and it's like,
a haiku is a poem.
Yeah.
Haiku is one poem.
That's three shows to read. Okay, cool.
As soon as you got those syllables out of there, it's like, oh, that was it.
That was your choice.
I told you.
No one told you to read a haiku. You decided to read a haiku. That's your poem.
Yeah, those are and it's kind of hard because I think it works out in the long run. So keep in mind that I'm not saying, it's not sometimes uncomfortable initially, but a lot of people, they're just like, I got all this from heart. It's almost, it's really similar to? It's really similar to poets who, they put their entire world into the one poem. You know what I mean? Where it's like, maybe the reason why you did that is because you just got so much on your heart that you just want to spew it out. But sometimes the reason why you do that is because you're like, I really want to show off as much as I possibly can in this time that I have on stage. And like that 7-minute poem that you just did, it did nothing less than exhaust everybody in the room more often than not. Now, there's some people out there that maybe they have like a really long poem that fits that criteria of somebody like a really good poem still, in my opinion. But more often than not, that I've seen, if it's being done at an open mic and a performer is up there for a really long time, it's because they really, really, really wanted to be on stage for a good amount of time. I used to be like that, man. Like I think, So go ahead.
I think it makes sense. On the one hand, I appreciate the cognizance that, hey, I want to demonstrate what I can do to other people. That goal to be that poet that everyone leaves the show remembering. I don't have an issue with that. But I have an issue with how you do that. I don't think the goal itself is a problem, but I think if you're not reading cues from the room, or you're not following expectations from the show, well, then now you're causing a problem.
Yeah, and well, I don't know. So, do you think that? I guess I agree with if like the baseline sentiment is I really want for people to understand and know that, hey, I'm really good at poems. You know what I mean? Like I understand that sentiment a lot, especially if you're in a room, man. This is just kind of taking it back to, man, shout out to, go back to a couple open mic shows, but the one that just wrapped up this year, last year, Writer's Block. And man, just kind of being in a room where you're like, okay, it's like Zach, Jeff, JG would be in there, and Jordan, like Sue Flat, Christina, freaking Vernell, Louise, Scott, like all these people are in the room, and let's say on this special night every one of those people are performing, and you're like, man, like, I really don't want to get up onto the open mic and just like be forgettable. You know what I mean? I really want to do something that is memorable. I want my work to be memorable. It's like it can be hard, and a lot of people try to accomplish that through longevity on stage. So they think if I'm just up here for a very long time, but I can like guarantee you, like if somebody's on stage if they're your average open micer in that space was on stage for 5 minutes, and like somebody like Sue Flat is on stage for 2.5 minutes, like I'm remembering the Sue Flat poem. You know what I mean? Like I'm remembering what Sue brought to the microphone more often than not, and that's like outside of even my work. Even, you know what I mean? That's like if you count my work in there, I'm like, it's really hard to try to create things that are as like memorable in those spaces, which is all just to say, like, trying to get it accomplished through longevity is not good, or I wouldn't recommend it. And I think that that's the temptation a lot of times with the open mic, because you're there most of the time as an audience member. And so that moment where your name is called and now you're the person with the microphone, it's really tempting to be like, well, let me hold on to this thing for as long as I can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of poets out there that just aren't really good at reading rooms and people, you know, because you can pick up on a lot of cues just from your audience. You know, if you're reading something and you're hearing, you know, verbal cues from people, like, you know, people like repeating your lines or being like, oh, and like stuff like that, you know, or if they like get off the stage, like, you know, like they're people are sending you signs, but they're also doing it non-verbally too. Like you see people on their phones. If you see people just starting to chat with the person next to them, if you see people kind of like looking around, you know, and it can be tricky when you're on stage because, you know, if you're reading off your phone or a piece of paper, you might not be able, you know, you might not be looking at people, but that's also probably a sign that, oh, maybe you're missing a key component of performance. So maybe that's something you need to kind of start paying attention to. You know, if you're on stage, you know, performing a poem and you don't know what even a couple people in the audience were doing while you were reading, that could be a sign that you're missing out on some of the people connection from just reading in general.
Have you ever been played off before on stage?
In what way?
Like I mean, it kind of depends, because like you'd have to kind of be at a show that has like a DJ or something of that nature, but like, you know, they start playing.
Just like just as the music comes on and stuff like. Hasn't happened to me, no.
So it happened to me one time, and here's the problem. Here's the problem, okay? Because it's actually, I have this poem, and it's actually. It's not a poem I would ever slam with, or I would like, you know, I perform it at very specific occasions. But I chose to perform it at the show that was very insistent on, once you got up here, you have exactly 4 minutes. Like, you have exactly 4 minutes. And they start playing music after that. And the problem happened when I got on stage, like the host, and like the host was like telling jokes like with the audience or whatever. So I get on stage, and like the host is still interacting with the audience member.
And that's your time.
Kind of from the little like the audience member, and the host is over there, so they're kind of interacting, whatever. And then people, it wasn't malicious or anything like that. It was just they were interacting. So I was just like, okay, now I get to perform. You know, now once everybody's quiet down, I'm starting to perform, and then like literally like people are laughing and like laughing at their interaction, and then the host is like, come on bro, this is your time. I'm like, what are you you are the one that is doing this. And so I start doing the poem, and then I'm probably 80% through the poem. It's the Jesus versus Satan battle rap. I'm like 80% through the poem, and so there's not like a comfortable place to stop. And I start hearing the music, and I'm just like, what's going on here, man? But yeah, that was the one time I ever got played off, and I still resent that show to this day.
Well, I think that's important you bring up, because I think it's important with readings, and I've said it before. People aren't going to remember the specific things you said, but they will definitely remember how you made them feel, whether they're in the audience or you're a performer. And if you have a show and people are leaving your show with that kind of taste in their mouth, I mean,
yeah.
And that's, the biggest way to get something to spread is word of mouth, so people are going to be, you talk to your other friends about shows, and now that's your experience with that show. And if you were telling me that story, but I was like, I don't know if I want to go to that show.
The show's no longer existing anyway. So
well, good. No,
and that I'm still here.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think one of the things when it comes to just what you're talking about when it comes to like spreading kind of word of mouth about a show, in the same way that like something really negative will spread, and it'll probably spread around faster, to be honest, if it's negative. Because if you have a really positive experience at an open mic, it's like probably 1 out of 10 people are even gonna go on, oh my gosh, this open mic was so amazing, right. This was great. But if you get mad at open mic and like something frustrating or disturbing happens to you at an open mic, oh man, you'll be on Twitter, you'll be on all the social medias, like spreading the word, don't go here, or whatever like that. And to be fair, it's like, open hosts can have off nights. I've definitely had like a few off nights here and there. And definitely just like the open mic space can be kind of off sometimes. Man, I remember this was like a couple years ago at the Nest, actually. It was like we were like 2 poets into the open mic list, and this guy gets on stage. This is like kind of a crazy story, but this guy gets on stage. I don't know, he's probably still out there somewhere. Shout out to him. I'm not sure exactly. I can't remember exactly what his name was, but he was a cool dude. But again, he's like the 3rd person that gets on the open mic list. And I was hosting that part of the show. So JG was hosting the second half of the show, and he had me hosting the first half of the show. And so I introduce him, he gets on stage, and he gets about, I would imagine, like a stanza into his poem, and then he just kind of stops, and he's leaning, and he's like doing a little bit, and he completely falls over. I caught him, like when I say, like the Lincoln Cafe, it's like, it's hard to describe. I'm not going to draw it for you, but just keep it layout. Yeah. It's a really unique kind of layout, but just think, okay, I could catch him where he's at the mic, like if he falls over, and it's all on ground level. So like me and him are standing, but he falls. I like caught him, and then a couple other people kind of helped out. And so there's this like large like bustle and making sure he's okay. He was just lightheaded. I think he had drank like a whole bunch of these AMP energy drinks. I don't know if I should have said that, but an energy drink of a nondescript matter.
We will still sponsor.
We will sponsor. I mean, it looked like he was having a good time. But he had drank a lot of these energy drinks, or at least like they were like all there was in his car. It was like all these cans of this stuff. And I think maybe he just did a whole bunch of those, because again, the problem was his fault, because he had did a whole bunch of those and he had not really eaten. So it was like he just had that going in the system without any food, and I think he just kind of crashed. But it was like an interesting thing, because it was like that happened, and then so we're like, we're gonna take an early break. And then I think it was just kind of hard to recover the night afterwards, because after you have something really jarring like that happen, it's like, okay, how do we host a regular? Because it was and not even to say that he was like in bad shape, but he was still kind of out of it. Like we ended up like, we were just like for about 30 minutes we're like, we don't know what's wrong with him, you know what I mean? And it was like he was just out of it. If that makes sense. And so then we end up the chef ends up making him something to eat. He eats, he's kind of sitting there, he drinks some water, and about 30 minutes after that he's like, he's fine. You know what I mean?
Cool.
And it was just like, oh man, great. I'm glad that I'm glad that you made it out of that. And then it was just like, okay, let's try to host this show. And it was just like it was a really weird kind of thing
Yeah,
to
kind
kind
of
of
weird energy.
jump back
Yeah.
into. It's just to say that yeah, like stuff can happen that'll kind of throw off a show. And I try to, if I go to an open mic, and I try to go to, if there's any new open mics in the city, I always like to make sure at the very least I go one time to support. And I mean honestly, if it's a show that I really enjoy, like I might be a regular. I might try to come. Life is a little bit different for me now than it was years ago. So it's not like I don't think that I can be like a regular at a show. But it's definitely something that I try not to judge a space by like if something crazy happened that night.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's probably not
Yeah,
the temperament of this show all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your craziest open mic story? Do you have any?
That's a really good question. All the ones I've been to have been relatively chill. Let's think. Yeah.
He's like, other than that open mic where the fire broke out and I had to save everybody, but that was like even a cool night.
No,
it was a solid night.
No, like I can't. I can't recall anything too crazy. I mean, what I will say is that I think sometimes you see open mics that try to pair poetry with other types of events, and I think that tends to be a difficult combination to make because poetry is such a kind of a niche kind of thing, and it often I think gets overshadowed by some of the more dominant art forms, especially like music. But then other things too. I mean, like sometimes you see it pair with like comedy, and even that, it's just a different energy. I mean, you can write a funny poem, but a comedy set's still pretty different than that. And I think a lot of times that sort of energy can overpower the poetry events. And so I don't know, just based on shows I've been to, I definitely prefer, if it's going to be an open mic, I definitely prefer it to just be a poetry one over something that's mixed.
Yeah, I would agree. So I have another. This is not scary. It's kind of a weird story about my first open mic experience in Cincinnati, matter of fact. And what's so interesting is that I actually like now I really love Cincinnati. And like I didn't love Cincinnati then, but like, we go to Cincinnati fairly often now. Shout out to my wife Ajane. She's actually here. But shout out to my wife Ajane. She actually has a April 10th, like a day named after her in Cincinnati, which is freaking crazy because of poems, right? But yeah, I mean, I've been to a couple Cincinnati poetry shows and open mics, and recently they've been good. But again, the first time I ever went to Cincinnati was a really interesting space. It was a space exactly like you said. It was an open mic that combined poetry and comedy. And I think the really specific thing that you kind of alluded to when it comes to poetry kind of being overshadowed, especially when you put it with something like comedy, where they're not necessarily working on individual jokes as much as they're working on the lengths of your set. So a comedian typically at these open mics are getting like 7 minutes and your poem is like 4 maybe, you know what I mean? Like
that, I mean, there's much greater chance that your poem can be even shorter than that.
Yeah, well, I mean, your poem, but like the time that you're on stage, like you're typically like if you get if you do the thing where like, hey, my name is blah blah blah, I am blah blah. People typically they thought this is my IG or whatever, and you might do that at the beginning or the end, but it's like that area of time is like 4 minutes, and like your comedian is typically they're given 7 minutes. Now, if they really just take 7 minutes and not whatever amount of time that a comedian wants to take, because it's like, the thing that's happening with comedy is a little bit more fluid and it's a little bit more, if people are laughing, maybe I have a little anecdote or something to throw on top of the joke that maybe wasn't originally there, that maybe extends out the time. So yeah, it was a comedy / poetry open mic. And okay, I'm not saying not to have open mics at bars. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that the host, I'm gonna put it out there, probably shouldn't drink. Or if they do, make sure it's like, because
or make that part of the show. Like if that's the show's identity, I'm not saying I would want to go to that show, but if that's your identity, like hey,
because if you do that, it's like I think I'll say so for this open mic, it was like I think it became very unorganized, and the kind of the worst part of it. So like there's a lot of things that happen during the show, but kind of the worst part of it is all the comedians ran over. When I say ran over time, it was like each comedian did at least 15 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
Right? And so imagine you're having a poem. So, and the poets were one poem. So mind you, the poets get up there. My name is blah, blah, blah. This is my poem. They do their one poem, and then you have 15 minutes.
And then you get your mini special
of
Kendrick from down the street. It's like, all right.
But it got the worst. It got this because the hosts had like a cousin or a nephew or something like that, but he was a comedian. And when I say he got up there and did legit, and I kid you not, he was not the feature. The features were poets that we brought from. So we brought these poets from the Nest, and they were coming up to Cincinnati so they could, perform and, get. I don't know, that's the thing that happens in open mic communities. Especially if you're like kind of putting together a tour of open mics, like you'll go to one open mic, but then you'll try to schedule all the other ones around there. Shout out to a lot of the open mic art, like people that do like tours. Shout out to Ephraim and Zay and Carl, like just a lot of the people that kind of build tours like that. But we're there, and again, I don't know if it's her cousin, her nephew, whatever the situation is, but he's a comedian, and he gets up there, and again, now mind you, on the flyer and the host opening up, it's like she's like, it's going to be poet, comedian, comedians, you have 7 minutes, poets, you have the one poem, you know what I mean? And I'm like, I can live with that. Now, okay, and also, mind you, so this is me very much younger in my performance days, very much younger just in linear time. So I'm there kind of as, JG's tag along in a way, but he's like, he has some poems. I really want him to perform. He tells that to the host, and the host is like, yeah, like, and that's what happened pretty much all the time until I started like building up rep for myself. But he was like, I really want him to perform, so get him up there. And so we get there, and like I haven't been up there yet. This guy is on stage. This guy is performing for 45 minutes. When I say he's performing for 45 minutes, I don't mean he's standing there for 45 minutes. I mean, for the first 10 minutes, he's just up there. And I'll say this, for the first 3 minutes, he was funny. At 10 minutes, I was like, okay, he's kind of just grasping. And then at like 17 minutes, that's when he's just like, and this is the thing that it's like, you're in for a long night if you're a comedian, say this. What else do I want to talk about? As soon as you hear that, you're like, oh, we're in for a long, because now he's just like, man, I can just challenge me to be funny. He's like, he's throwing it out to the audience. Give me a topic to talk about. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And mind you, the host is like, crap. Talk about politics. What are you doing? So yeah, that was a very fun esque time. But yeah, so like so that happened. Then the features perform, because again, mind you, it's like 11:45 at this time, and that's when the features get to go on. And it's like at a bar as well. It's like this. It's at a lounge actually. So it's like the spacing is kind of off. But yeah, so the features perform. People really love the features, and then the host is kind of a little bit tipsy, and she comes up to me and she's just like, "Your name is Mathia, right?" I'm like, "It's Matthias." She's like, "Matthias, okay. Did you want to perform tonight?" And now, mind you, like when I was younger, I'm like, yes, like I want to perform every night, but like just understand, like I'm really frustrated right now. But like, of course, I've already been standing here for
I'm
all this
committed.
time. Like I'm already
I'm
here,
committed.
so I have to do it. And so like then I perform, and then they really rock. I still gotta remember. I gotta memorize that dinner poem one more time at some point in my life. But yeah, I performed there. But that was like, I remember driving home that hour and a half drive from Cincinnati being like really like, man, this was ridiculous. But those are,
Yes.
and I want to, and mind you, like those are the shows that there's a lot of shows that have that kind of makeup that they're good for like 2 or 3 shows, and then they're kind of like, the real issue isn't even necessarily audience attendance, so to speak, because that's not even, if that was a thing that kind of shook the core of that space, I would be shocked, because it was like, it didn't seem like that was a thing that they were even caring about in real time. The thing that typically happens is like the people just aren't super committed to the concept of the open mic, because it's like they're willing to do all that stuff during open mic anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah,
you're not really caring what's on stage.
Yeah.
Necessarily.
So then they're like, and that's kind of the thing that happens with a lot of open mics too, is like you'll have an open mic where it's like, yeah, we're saying we're doing it every week, but man, this week I'm a little bit tired. I don't really feel like promoting. I don't really feel like putting a flyer out. And so, you know what? We'll just be back next week. And then next week that turns into 2 weeks. And then we're a bi-weekly show. And then, oh man, well, hold on. Something happened during and so it's just to say that, and not to say that things can't come up for people or things can't kind of surprise you, but it's just to say that that's another kind of really big symptom of somebody, like you'll see those things seeping into your show, you know what I mean? Where it's like, man, was my commitment level even super high, or did I just want to be a host every single month? And because I can stand in front of an audience and they have to listen to me because I'm the person with the microphone, then I'm willing to do that. Or and then all that other work caught up to you, and now you're like, man, I don't want to do all the things that are required in order to really run this open mic. So yeah,
it is a commitment, and it's hard, starting off a show too. It can be hard. And one of the hardest things to do with events is just getting people to show up, and the amount of promotion you have to do is just, you have to be willing to commit to that if you want it to be something that's built up, especially for the initial stage.
One of the things, man, and one of the things I really enjoyed about, and I'm sure we'll get back to it like some point, but one of the things I really enjoyed about Diversus is because like, and I think, okay, so like, and to be clear, like, so Diversus as like a platform, and as like, even as the show incarnation was like Jeff's like brainchild, right? And so I think that being able to kind of see the intention behind this space, because that's another thing that a lot of open mics don't really have. They don't really, it's like they just know that they want to be an open mic, but it felt like Diversus had I know you understood there was like a purpose that was operative in this space. That wasn't just, oh, I want to be. And it's also like, Jeff really wanted, and we still think, of course, people still, I don't know what I want, maybe, but I know Jeff really wants like for you to grow as a person and an artist, right?
It's true. I want people who are interested in not just doing a thing, but trying to do things at a high level, as high as possible for yourself, I want that for people.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, because it's like, I think a lot of people that operate open mics, and this isn't to speak down on any open mic whatsoever, so please don't take this with any kind of malintent, because it shouldn't be. But there's a lot of people that run and operate poetry open mics that don't have a real care for like the poetry that's involved.
Yeah, the goal isn't really to help. The goal isn't to help.
Yeah, well, it's like not even just the goal isn't to help. It's like they wouldn't know what help is, even if that was their intention. You know what I mean? And I'm sure to them, they think that is the goal. They think that like they're bringing poetry into the space. I'm just like, well, hold on. If most of the show is your host, cracking wise the entire time, and then your show also goes from 8 o'clock to, oh my god, there's like a lot of shows that go from like 8 to midnight, and I'm like,
4 hours.
you might be thinking, oh, I can be awake during those times. Like, you don't understand how long of a show that is, until, especially if you're a host, you probably thought about it and like, that's a long show. But I think a lot, yeah, it's a long time to sit through a show. It's a long time to try to be active during a show. The show should feel like you experienced a lot in a very amount of time. I really like shows that get in as many poets. Like, if 30 people sign onto your open mic list, I would very much be happy with listening to 30 poems. You know what I mean? Let me. It feels like a lot, okay, but like, at the click that I would go to an open mic show now, like I'd be fine with like listening to a night filled with poems, and then knowing that, okay, the thing that was priority at this poetry open mic was like the poems. You know what I mean? And if the curator of that space is invested in, okay, like, yes, we got poems in here, now let's get people invested in their work, like, and that's kind of the second tier that a lot of open mic curators, hosts, whatever, that they're not invested in, or they just wouldn't even know, they don't even know what that is. Like, there's a lot of open mic hosts that have nothing to do with the poetry world or the poetry community, except that they are a host of a poetry show. And I'm like, oh, when you run into that, it's like, oh yeah, these, again, they may have great intentions, but a lot of times their intentions are, man, people want to say poems on the microphone, people want to hear poems on the microphone, so let's charge them. Man, there's like shows that'll charge like $15 for an open mic. And I remember, man, there's been a couple times I'll like go to like a show and I'm like, man, like I'm paying like, oh, it's like a good amount of money for an open mic, and then they're like, Matthias, do 5 poems. I'm like, what? Which is all just to say that, no, go ahead. Which is, I mean, I'm just saying that, like, there's a lot of different ways that, the poetry itself can get kind of lost in the intentions or the wants of like the host or the staff of a poetry open mic.
Yeah, and I think that in general, if you do a show, you want people to show up, but I think also that sometimes we get, like most things, you get hung up on like the kind of the vanity things. It's like, look at how many people showed up, look how many people we had on our list and stuff like that. And that's not always, the most important measure of a show's success.
Yeah. So what would you say what is your top 3 things to find in an open mic? If you had to name a top 3 thing.
I want to come away with a poem that stood out to me. Like, I think a lot of times, like, nowadays, like, I don't necessarily enjoy going to open mics the way I used to. Just because I don't always walk away with it with like a poem that like stood out to me.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of kind of forgettable poems. I mean, everyone has forgettable poems. I mean, I have lots of poems that are forgettable in the sense that you hear them, and that doesn't mean they're bad poems. They could be good poems. They could be nice poems. It's not poems that you necessarily want to return to. You know what I mean? So like I guess that's kind of the first thing. Like, I want to be, if I go to an open mic and there's one poem that like really stands out, then in general for me that was a good open mic experience nowadays. But I think the other thing too is just also trying to connect with people there that are also really interested in poetry, to the point where they're not just like writing it, but they're reading it, and they want, like, it's something that they want to do for a long time and have it be a part of their life. Because I think a lot of times you go to open mics and you see people that this is the poem that they wrote in a fit of rage and then they have it, and the next time they write a poem is when they feel inspired, and that's always like, I'm not looking to connect with poets that write when they feel inspired.
Something that's interesting, man. Like I tend to, I agree with the networking aspect of wanting to connect with people that are like, okay, I don't want to just have done a poem. I want to do poems. You know what I mean? Like I get that, and I'm in agreement with that. But there is something, I think, to my experience, that feels special about, man. We were doing one of the Seventh Draft shows. Shout out to Seventh Draft folks. We're doing one of the Seventh Draft shows a couple years ago, and there was this woman. She had, I think she had like 6 kids. Like, she had like a lot of kids. But this was like the one night she was able to like get off. Like, and I don't think she was like, the kids weren't like babies. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, they were like, I think the youngest one might have been 8 or 9. You know what I mean? And like, I think the oldest was like, in senior high school or something like that. So it was like, they were older or whatever, but it was like, she just didn't have time. Right. And she had written, I guess, when you're a host, you get little tidbits of information. Maybe if this is her first time, like, okay, what makes you really want to, and I can just remember she wrote a little bit back in school. She wrote a little bit after, when she got out of school, but she got pregnant fairly early, after school, and just kept being pregnant, right? And always had a job. She was married, and so it was like, like her and her husband, were raising these kids, and I have 0 kids right now. Jeff has the one child right now, and I can tell you that even like watching people raise children, like, that's exhausting. Like, I could only imagine being like, okay, six kids. Man, like, you're going through it. So it's just to say that, she was just like, she just didn't have it in her time, in her schedule, to be able to like perform poems. And so this was actually the first open mic she had ever went to. And she had written poems for a while, but this is the first time ever performing her poems. Right. And it's something, and like, okay, listen, the quality of the poem or the assumed quality that anybody might have wasn't even the point. You know what I mean? Like, that's not even the point to me. It's like, the point to me was like, man, like, this person was, they really love poems and they really enjoy writing poems, but there's priorities in your life that kind of take over. And for some people, those things are a little bit more insurmountable than it is for other people. So you have this person who had all these things, going on in her real life, because like the poetry open mic, that's not as much as it has vibrant as it is or whatever. Like, I implore you to like be grounded in like a life that you're living outside of it as well. But she came to the open mic, she performed, and she had an amazing time. She was just like, oh, I'll be back. And I think she came back like once or twice, like after that, too. But she was just like, I'll be back. I loved it here. It was great. She did a poem, and it was cool because she did a poem about like just how powerful of a woman she was or anything like that. And what was really cool is because I remember commenting on it as a host afterwards. I was just like, now, before you got on the stage, you said you had 6 kids. You didn't mention a single one of them kids in that poem, and we all clapped up for that. Like, we were just like, listen. It's like, it's hard to be like, man, like, this thing encompasses so much of my life, but like, you know what? When I'm out here, like, I have an identity that's outside of that as well, and so it was really cool. But yeah, which is all just to say that, like, yeah, like, that's not a person who I think is gonna walk out of here. And I mean, to be clear, if she's out there killing it in the poetry world, like, I wouldn't be incredibly shocked, you know what I mean? But it would just be to say that, like, that's not a person that I think is gonna go to the workshops and is gonna get all the books and read all the books and all this other stuff. Maybe it's just not like a time something that she has the time for, but it's like, that to me, out of that night, was the most memorable experience poetry wise. And I think that's the thing that I really enjoy about open mics, because, like, there's a lot of us that are out there that are really pushing, that are really trying, you know, and I wouldn't even say I'm like the top tier even in that sector, but there's a lot of people out there that are really pushing, really trying, really doing their hardest to really create this work and go as hard as they possibly can. I'm like, that's like really admirable, and I really appreciate those people. And then there's like the people that, you know, they have these bursts of genius, this bursts of poems, and I'm like, I think those are just as important to the culture of the open mic, because if you can create a culture of the open mic where people feel really comfortable and really excited to perform for their first time, and then just get comfortable with performing and stuff like that, like that's really fun to me.
I'll be honest, I'm getting a little tired.
Fair enough.
So I might close this out.
Yeah,
but
man.
We would also like to know, what are your thoughts on open mic experiences? What has been your favorite? Do you have any horror stories? Was that you who fainted on stage? We want to know.
We do want to know. Are you okay?
Okay?
We just left you there, and yeah.
But closing us out, I'm Jeff.
I'm also Jeff, but you can call me Matthias because people do that all the time.
Thank you guys for hanging out with us. We'll be back next week with the verses. Bye. You guys take care.
See ya.